The wind on Halden's Reach never stopped. It scraped across the metal domes of the mining colony day and night, carrying dust that turned every sunset a dull orange. Daniel Reyes had learned to sleep through it years ago. What he had not learned to sleep through was the alarm that woke him that night. A low buzzing signal, meaning a ship had crashed somewhere in the outer fields. He was not required to go. He was a maintenance engineer, not part of the salvage crew. But sleep would not come back easily, and the thought of a fresh wreck full of usable parts pulled him out of his bunk anyway. He pulled on his worn jacket and grabbed his tool bag, stepping out into the cold dark. The wreck was small, half buried in a shallow crater a few kilometers from the colony wall. Most of it had burned on entry. Daniel walked around the twisted hull alone, his flashlight cutting through drifting smoke. The ship had no markings he recognized, nothing like the cargo haulers or mining shuttles that usually crashed out here. It was sleek, almost elegant, even in its ruin. He found the cargo hold cracked open like an egg itself, metal peeled back from the inside. Whatever had been kept in there had not gone quietly. Daniel climbed inside carefully, boots crunching over broken glass and scorched wiring. That is when he saw it. Nestled in a bed of shredded padding was an actual egg, larger than anything he had ever seen, its shell a deep violet-blue color under a layer of soot. It was cracked along one side. He should have called it in immediately. Colony law was clear about unidentified alien salvage. But something about the egg made him stop and crouch beside it instead. It was warm, not from the fire around it, but warm on its own, like something inside was still breathing. Daniel sat there for a long moment, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. He thought about the report he was supposed to file, the security teams that would come and take whatever this was to some lab, probably to be studied, maybe destroyed if it turned out dangerous. He thought about all the times the colony had thrown away things that were still worth saving, just because they were inconvenient. He wrapped the egg in his jacket and carried it home. His quarters were small, barely enough room for a bed and a workbench, but he cleared a corner and set the egg on a folded blanket near the heater vent. He told himself he would report it in the morning, once he had gotten a better look, once he understood what it actually was. Morning came and went. He did not report it. 3 days later, in the middle of a quiet evening, the shell finally split. Daniel nearly dropped the tool he was holding when he heard the sound, a soft cracking followed by a small, high whimper. He knelt beside the egg as a piece of shell fell away, revealing a tiny clawed foot, then a curled tail, then finally a small head with closed eyes and skin the color of a night sky just before dawn. It was a dragon, a real, living, breathing dragon, no bigger than a house cat, shivering and struggling weakly to free itself from the rest of the shell. Daniel had seen images of creatures like this in old records, myths and species told about ancient guardians from a hidden part of the galaxy, but he had never imagined one would end up in his hands. He carefully helped peel away the last of the shell, and the tiny creature blinked open eyes that glowed faintly silver in the dim light. It let out another weak sound, more of a question than a cry, and pressed itself against his hand. Daniel had no idea what he was doing. He had never raised anything in his life, let alone an alien hatchling that could probably grow bigger than his entire living quarters. But when the little creature curled into his palm and stopped shivering, something in his chest settled in a way he had not expected. He thought of a name almost without meaning to, watching the way her scales seemed to swallow the light, except for faint threads of silver running through them, like stars caught in a dark sky. Sable. It felt right. Outside, the wind kept scraping against the domes, indifferent to the fact that everything in Daniel's small life had just changed. He did not know yet that the ship she came from had been fleeing something far more dangerous than any storm. He did not know that hiding her would put him at odds with colony law, with fear, and eventually with an empire far larger than anything Halden's Reach had ever seen. All he knew, sitting there in the quiet with a small dragon asleep in his hands, was that he was not about to let anyone take her away. Keeping a secret on a mining colony was harder than Daniel expected. Halden's Reach was small, barely 4,000 people packed into a cluster of domes and tunnels, and everyone knew everyone else's business sooner or later. He had maybe a week before someone noticed the strange sounds coming from his quarters or the extra food rations he was quietly setting aside. Sable grew fast. Within days she had gone from a creature that fit in his palm to one the size of a small dog. restless and curious about everything. She chewed through 2 pairs of his boots, knocked over his toolbox more times than he could count, and once nearly set off the smoke alarm trying to warm herself by breathing a small puff of flame at the heater vent. Daniel found himself laughing more in those 2 weeks than he had in the past 2 years combined. But laughter did not solve the problem of hiding her. The colony administrator, a tired man named Ferris who ran security in his spare time, called a meeting about the crashed ship. Daniel sat near the back of the room, trying to look uninterested while every word made his stomach tighten. Scans of the wreck had identified the vessel as belonging to a species called the Vanthori, a name most people in the room did not recognize, but Ferris clearly did, judging by how carefully he said it. The Vanthori, Ferris explained, were an old and powerful species from deep space, rarely seen and almost never dealing with humans directly. Their territory was vast, and their military strength was the subject of more than one cautionary tale told among frontier colonies. The wreck, according to the scans, had been carrying something valuable, something alive. Security teams were ordered to search the crash site and the surrounding area for any sign of what had escaped the wreckage. Daniel walked home that night with his hood pulled low, mind racing. If anyone connected the dots, if anyone searched his quarters, Sable would be found within minutes. He decided he needed help, someone who would not report him immediately. He thought of Mireille Fontaine, a young xenobiologist who had recently taken a research post on the colony, mostly studying local rock formations and the rare insect life that survived in the dust storms. She had a reputation for being more interested in learning than in following rules exactly. It was a risk, but Daniel had few options left. He found her in the small science dome late that evening, hunched over a microscope. When he described what he had found, careful at first to leave out details, she simply looked up and asked to see the creature. There was no fear in her expression, only fascination. That night, Mireille crouched beside Sable in Daniel's quarters, watching the little dragon sniff curiously at her hand before deciding she was trustworthy enough to climb into her lap. Mireille's eyes were wide with wonder as she examined the faint silver markings along Sable's scales. "She's not just a Vanthori hatchling," Mireille said quietly. "Look at these markings. I've read reports on this species before coming out here. Markings like this are supposed to mean something important, some kind of bloodline marker. This isn't just any dragon, Daniel. This could be someone important." Daniel felt a chill despite the warm room. Important meant valuable. Valuable meant people would come looking, and not gently. They agreed to keep the secret between them for now, at least until they understood more about what they were dealing with. Mireille offered to help disguise Sable's growth in the colony's limited resource logs, quietly rerouting extra food and heat allocations under the excuse of side research projects. It was not a perfect solution, but it bought time. Weeks passed into months. Sable grew large enough that hiding her in Daniel's quarters became impossible, and they moved her care to an unused storage tunnel on the colony's edge, one Mireille had access to under her research permits. Daniel visited every day after his shifts, bringing food and simply spending time with her, and slowly Sable came to recognize the sound of his footsteps before he even entered the tunnel, her tail thumping excitedly against the floor. The bond between them deepened in ways Daniel had not expected. She was not just a secret he was protecting anymore. She had become something closer to family, the first creature in years that greeted him like his presence actually mattered. But even as their bond grew stronger, the search for the missing hatchling had not stopped. Somewhere far beyond Halden's reach, ships bearing the crest of the Vanthori Empire were beginning to widen their search pattern, moving slowly but surely toward the edge of human space, toward a small, dusty colony that had no idea what was coming for it. 6 years changed Halden's reach more than anyone expected, and most of that change had scales. Sable was no longer a creature that could hide in a storage tunnel. She had grown into something enormous, her body stretching longer than a cargo shuttle, wings folding along her back like sails at rest. Her scales had darkened into a deep violet blue that seemed to shift with the light, threaded through with silver markings that had spread further across her body as she matured. She was, by any measure, magnificent. Hiding her was no longer possible, so the colony had done the next best thing. It had learned to live with her. It had not been easy at first. When Sable outgrew the tunnel and had to be moved to an open yard near the colony's edge, panic spread through Halden's reach within hours. Security teams were called, weapons were drawn, and for a tense afternoon it seemed as though the colony might try to destroy the very creature Daniel had spent years protecting. It was Daniel who stood between the armed teams and Sable, arms spread, insisting she was not a threat. It was Sable who proved it, lowering her head calmly and allowing children from the colony to approach and touch her scales under careful supervision, showing no aggression despite the weapons pointed at her. Slowly, fear turned into curiosity, and curiosity turned into something like acceptance. Sable became a strange kind of local legend, the gentle giant who lived on the colony's edge and who apparently listened to no one except a quiet maintenance engineer named Daniel Reyes. Daniel himself had changed too, though less visibly. He had been promoted twice, mostly because his work with the colony's growing power systems left little time for anything else besides caring for Sable. He still visited her every evening, still brought food, still sat with her under the artificial lights of the yard as the wind scraped against the domes overhead. Their bond had become something the whole colony recognized, even if they did not fully understand it. What the colony did not know was that word of a Vanthari dragon living openly. Dr. Mireille Fontaine had continued her research quietly over the years, publishing careful, limited papers about Sable's growth and behavior under a research permit that avoided drawing too much outside attention. But some information always slipped through official channels, and rumors traveled faster than any report could be contained. Traders passing through the colony mentioned the dragon to other traders. Those traders mentioned it to others. Eventually, the story reached ears. It was around this time that Captain Osei arrived at Halden's Reach, commanding a small defense fleet sent by the Regional Human Authority to assess potential security risks tied to the growing rumors. Osei was practical. His first meeting with Sable did little to ease his concerns, mostly because Sable, sensing his distrust, chose to greet him by lowering her head to eye level and staring at him in complete silence for nearly a full minute before finally huffing out a puff of smoke and turning away, uninterested. Daniel had to hide a smile at the captain's obvious discomfort. "She's not a weapon," Daniel told him later, standing in the yard as Sable rested nearby. "She's family." "I know how that sounds, but it's true." Osei was not entirely convinced, but he was not foolish either. He recognized the strength radiating from the creature, the calm control she showed even when provoked, and understood that whatever this bond was between the dragon and the young engineer, it was not something easily explained by simple animal instinct. Meanwhile, far beyond human space, within the vast reaches of Vanthari territory, a different kind of attention had turned toward the rumors drifting in from the frontier. A council chamber, ancient and quiet, received a report that made even seasoned elders go still. A hatchling bearing rare bloodline markings, believed lost in a crash years ago, might still be alive. Plans began to form. A fleet would be sent, quietly at first, to confirm the rumors before anything else was decided. Halden's Reach, a colony that had spent years simply trying to survive on the edge of nowhere, was about to become the center of something far larger than anyone there could have imagined. The sky over Halden's Reach had never held anything larger than a supply freighter. That changed on a gray morning when three massive shapes broke through the clouds, their hulls a smooth pearl white unlike anything in human design, moving with a silence that felt almost unnatural for something so enormous. Alarms blared across the colony within seconds. Captain Osei's small defense fleet scrambled into formation, though everyone watching from the ground understood, without needing to be told, that they stood no real chance against ships of that size. Daniel felt his stomach drop the moment he saw them, some instinct telling him exactly who had finally arrived. He ran toward the yard where Sable rested, finding her already awake, her head raised toward the sky, body tense in a way he had never seen before. Not fear, recognition. "They found you," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to her. The largest of the three ships descended slowly at the colony's edge, landing gear extending with a hiss that echoed across the open ground. A ramp lowered, and figures began to emerge, tall and elegant, moving with the same silent precision as their ships. At the front walked an elder woman with pale, silver-streaked skin and robes that shimmered faintly with embedded light patterns. Her presence alone seemed to still the wind itself. Captain Osei moved to intercept them, flanked by a handful of armed personnel, though it was clear from his posture that he understood weapons would mean nothing here. The elder woman stopped a short distance away, her sharp eyes sweeping over the gathered humans before settling, unmistakably, on the massive dragon standing near Daniel. "I am Counselor Yuren," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "We have come regarding a hatchling lost 6 years ago. Our scans confirm a bloodline signature matching hers here in this settlement. I will not ask twice. Bring her forward." The colony held its breath. Osei glanced back at Daniel, uncertain, caught between diplomacy and the very real fear of provoking a war with a fleet capable of erasing Halden's reach in minutes. Daniel stepped forward instead, placing himself slightly in front of Sable, though he knew it was a symbolic gesture at best against ships like these. "She's not a prisoner," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "She's not being held here. She stays because she wants to." Yuren's gaze sharpened, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like every thought in his head was being read. "You believe a hatchling of the Vanthari chooses to remain among humans in a settlement like this, rather than return to her people?" It was Sable who answered, not with words at first, but by stepping fully into view, wings unfurling slightly as she rose to her full height for the first time in front of the fleet. A murmur of shock rippled through the Vanthari crew behind Yuren. Then Sable spoke, her voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that silenced the yard completely. "I remember the crash," Sable said. "I remember the fire, and I remember waking up cold and alone in wreckage that no one came to search for me in time. Everyone assumed I died there. No one from our fleet ever came looking, not for years." "He did." She turned her head toward Daniel. "He found me before anyone else did. He kept me alive when it would have been easier, safer even, to leave me to whatever fate the crash intended." Yuren's expression, calm and controlled until now, flickered with something unreadable. "The crash was reported as an accident," she said carefully. "A navigational failure." "Was it?" Sable asked, and something in her tone made even Yuren go still. The tension in the yard shifted from fear of an invading fleet to something far more complicated, an unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Daniel watched the exchange, understanding for the first time that there might be more to Sable's crash landing all those years ago than either of them had ever considered. Yuren studied Sable for a long moment before finally speaking again, her voice quieter now, almost cautious. "We should speak of this somewhere more private, Highness." The word hung in the air, and Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the massive ships parked at the colony's edge. "Highness, whatever Sable truly was, whatever she had left behind all those years ago, it was far more significant than anyone at Halden's Reach had ever guessed." The colony's meeting hall had never held a gathering like this. On one side stood Daniel, Mireille, and Captain Osei, still trying to understand the shift that had happened in the yard. On the other stood Counselor Yuren and 2 of her advisors, their expressions carefully neutral in the way of people trained since birth to reveal nothing. Sable sat near the center, too large for the room really, her tail curled carefully around the edge so as not to disturb anything. Yuren was the one who finally broke the silence, though her eyes stayed fixed on Sable rather than the humans in the room. "Your mother died shortly after your egg was laid," she said quietly. "You were the last of a bloodline many considered dangerous, not because of anything you had done, but because of what you represented. A claim to leadership that certain factions within our court did not wish to see fulfilled." Sable's eyes narrowed slightly. "The crash was not an accident." "No," Yuren admitted. "It was arranged. The transport carrying your egg was meant to relocate you somewhere safe, away from court politics, until you were old enough to be protected properly. Someone within our own ranks altered the flight path instead, guiding the ship toward a region known for its instability, hoping the crash would appear accidental. It was meant to look like a tragic loss, nothing more." The room went still. Daniel felt his chest tighten, understanding at last the full weight of what he had stumbled into all those years ago, kneeling beside a cracked egg in a burning wreck he had not been authorized to search. "They wanted me dead," Sable said, her voice low. "Yes," Yuren said simply. There was no softness in the admission, only the plain acknowledgement of a truth long buried. Search teams were sent afterward, officially to recover the wreckage and confirm the loss. Unofficially, some were sent to ensure no survivors remained, in case the crash alone had not been enough. Daniel's mind flashed back to the crash site, to the way the cargo hold had been torn open from the inside, to how quickly he had made the decision to take the egg home instead of reporting it through proper channels. If he had waited even a few more hours, if he had followed protocol and called it in, whoever those search teams were might have reached her first. I found her before they did, Daniel said quietly, the realization settling heavy in his chest. I didn't know. I just knew she was still alive, and I couldn't leave her there. Yuren's gaze finally shifted to him, studying him with an intensity that felt different now, less suspicious and more genuinely curious. You had no knowledge of any of this. No understanding of bloodlines, politics, or the danger involved. You simply saw something alive and chose to protect it. That's all it was, Daniel admitted. I didn't do anything special. You did the one thing our own people failed to do, Yuren said. You did not look away. The weight of that statement seemed to settle over the entire room. Sable moved closer to Daniel, lowering her head until it rested gently against his shoulder, an act she had done countless times over the years, but which now carried a far heavier meaning in front of the Vanthari delegation. The conspirators who arranged the crash believe they succeeded, Yuren continued. They have spent years consolidating influence within the court, assuming your bloodline had ended. Your survival, and your return, changes everything. It exposes them for what they did. And if I don't want to return? Sable asked. If I choose to stay? Yuren considered this for a long moment before answering carefully. Your survival alone is enough to challenge them, Highness. What you choose to do with that truth is yours to decide. But know that your return, even briefly, would allow those responsible to finally be held accountable. Facing them would not mean giving up the life you've built here. Sable turned her gaze toward Daniel, silent for a moment, clearly weighing the years they had shared against the responsibility that had just been placed before her. Daniel said nothing. Understanding this was a decision only she could make, though everything in him wanted to tell her to stay. Finally, Sable spoke, her voice steady. Then I will return, briefly, to see this through. But I do not go alone, and I do not stay there permanently. My home is here now, as much as it is anywhere among my own people. Yuren inclined her head, something that might have been respect flickering across her expression. That, she said quietly, may be exactly the kind of change our court needs. The Vanthari homeworld looked nothing like Daniel had imagined. He had pictured something cold and imposing, all sharp towers and silent halls. But instead he found himself walking beside Sable through gardens that stretched farther than entire districts back on Halden's reach, filled with plants that glowed faintly under a violet sky. He felt impossibly small here, a single human standing beside the returning heir of an ancient bloodline. Yet Sable never once let him fall behind, her presence beside him a constant reminder that he belonged wherever she did. The court proceedings, when they came, were tense and formal, conducted in a chamber filled with elders who had spent years believing the last of Sable's bloodline was gone. Counselor Yuren presented the truth carefully, laying out evidence of the falsified flight records and the conspirators who had arranged the crash years ago. Daniel stood quietly at the edge of the chamber, watching as faces among the gathered elders shifted from shock to anger as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. The conspirators, once powerful figures within the court, were exposed and removed from their positions within days, their carefully built influence crumbling once the truth came to light. Sable did not gloat or demand harsh punishment, something that seemed to surprise many of the elders watching her. She simply insisted the truth be made known publicly, so that no one else could ever attempt something similar again in silence. What surprised the court even more, though, was what came after. When offered the throne that was rightfully hers, Sable did not accept it outright. Instead, she proposed something that had not been considered in generations, a shared arrangement where she would serve as a voice within the court while remaining free to live beyond it, splitting her time between Vanthari space and the small human colony that had once given her a second chance at life. It was an unconventional request, and it took weeks of careful negotiation before the elders finally agreed, recognizing that her survival story alone had already proven she valued loyalty and honesty over rigid tradition. News of what had happened spread quickly once the formal announcements were made. A human engineer from a small mining colony had unknowingly saved the heir of an ancient bloodline from an assassination attempt, simply by choosing kindness over procedure. The story traveled through both human and Vanthari space alike, reshaping how each side viewed the other. For the first time in generations, formal diplomatic talks began between humanity and the Vanthari Empire, with Halden's Reach chosen as the symbolic site for the first treaty signing, given its unlikely place at the center of everything. Captain Osei, once deeply skeptical of Sable's presence in the colony, found himself standing beside Daniel during the treaty ceremony, watching as representatives from both species gathered together for the first time in living memory. He offered Daniel a small nod of respect, an acknowledgement neither of them needed to put into words. Dr. Mireille Fontaine, whose quiet research had once helped keep Sable hidden, was later invited to lead official studies on Vanthari and human cooperation, her early notes on Sable's growth becoming foundational documents in a field that had not existed until now. As for Daniel, he never sought recognition for what he had done. He returned to Halden's Reach much the same as he had left it, still preferring quiet evenings in the yard over formal ceremonies and titles. But everything around him had changed. The colony that had once been a forgotten outpost on the edge of human space was now known throughout the galaxy as the place where an unlikely friendship had reshaped relations between two civilizations. Sable often returned to that same yard, resting beside him as the wind scraped gently against the domes, exactly as it had the night everything began. When asked by curious diplomats and reporters why she had chosen to remain loyal to a simple human engineer instead of returning fully to a life of power and privilege, her answer never changed. "He never asked what I could offer him," she would say. "He only asked if I was going to be all right. That is worth more than any throne." And so the story spread across the galaxy, not as a tale of politics or power, but as a simple reminder that the smallest acts of kindness, offered without any expectation of reward, sometimes end up changing the course of history in ways no one could have predicted.